Howdy, all you delicious people. Superman, the movie. So, ultimately, knowing full well, this movie and the second movie were shot like one after the other. So, basically, all the casting of this movie was to go, oh, well, yeah, like these people coming back for the second one. So, I enjoy this movie, but when also watching it, it comes down as it being a little light for me because there's a lot of time of just, hey, you gotta get to know this person and you got to be familiar with him. You gotta know what his favorite baseball team is and and doesn't he have a girlfriend and like that kind of thing. We also get to find out little things that ultimately is Clark's or Superman's weakness in this movie, which I thought was interesting. The whole lead thing I think was kind of interesting. But we also got to see some of Clark's early days, some of what Clark does in his early years, his young years. And yeah, I thought that this movie was like it's quaint for the time. It's just kind of really to the fact it's like okay, like this one is just kind of like the starter film, and once we get to the other ones, it'll get more impactful and much more interesting. From kind of hearing in the very first kind of drafts of the script of this movie, ultimately they were going to have all kind of like certain references of that time to ultimately have Superman just meet people like Kojak or some kind of other goofy things going on where ultimately like within this film we would have like Superman ultimately meeting like the president and ultimately just like yeah like yeah kind of thing like yeah truth justice and American way, hey president kind of thing. And like so ultimately we like I guess the original draft was ultimately to have Superman like bumping shoulders with every single like person of that time, which I think is just kind of goofy to have him meet every single person originally, and thank God that they didn't go that route because that would have been just like a really boring movie. Um, we ultimately have it to where there are interesting moments where Superman is just kind of meeting people, and I think that those kind of moments are hilarious. We ultimately have it to where like a burglar is trying to get away with something, and Superman is like having a problem with the elevator there, buddy. Having a problem with an elevator? Huh? You have no problem there? You try to hit the buttons there, buddy? So, you ultimately have. I think the most memorable scene to me is probably the helicopter scene in this movie. Just because recently that's where Superman just kind of really. Like, there's some interesting effects going on in here, but there's also some goofy stuff going on where ultimately Superman is catching Lois and she's ultimately just like you've got me, well who's got you? That line is so goofily delivered and I thoroughly enjoy it. It's just like the goofy like approach of just you have these other heroes that when looking at it you have like a Batman who has to come in on a like a wire or like stuff like that, and like you just have Superman who can just fly. And so recently also hearing like how adamantly like uh Christopher Reeves was with this story. Evidently he held his script like the Bible and stuff like that to where ultimately in all actuality, in opposite, we'd have Margaret Kidder, which ultimately is Lois Lane, that would just kind of do a little bit more, like have a little bit more fun and kind of do some kind of goofy lines and see what could deliver. And ultimately, I guess like Margaret and Christopher kind of just butted heads a little bit with how everything is to be delivered from what I've seen in documentaries and such, which I just kind of find that kind of fun, and just to kind of see a little behind the scenes stuff of this movie. So when when going into this film, I thought that reasonably it was kind of interesting to see Krypton, but when looking at Krypton, it's like every single time we see a different Krypton. Every single different kind of show, movie, anything. It's always a very vastly different Krypton, and it's kind of funny to see that the Fortress of Solitude that we get in this movie is ultimately the same Fortress of Solitude that you see every single time you see a Fortress of Solitude. It's always the same thing. It always looks the same. Uh, but always Krypton is always looking different in some kind of capacity and whatever. Like especially in this iteration, it looks like Krypton is just this big, huge, like white ball of something, and I'm like, okay, that looks so odd in this film. But I ultimately like how in Krypton it seems like we have kind of variations of ultimately uh, Jor-El's suits. Ultimately, to kind of see that there was a black and white, like a black shirt and a white symbol. Ultimately, now remembering like Smallville, where eventually they went that route in season 8, but then eventually went into doing like subtle variations of that suit. Where ultimately, also when looking at Young Justice, we ultimately have Superboy, who ultimately has a red Superman symbol, but uh, a white outfit on, which ultimately, yeah, like I just kind of find that to be just kind of fascinating that like several variations that ultimately meant uh, like a past of kind of color combinations that they went with at some point in the shows or movies or whatever. So I think that's all that I really want to say about this movie in spoiler terms. Really, it's just kind of like you gotta get the goofy. You get kind of Perry White that is ultimately kind of bringing it to us that ultimately this entire movie is basically going to be like, hey, what's Superman all about? Like, what's his favorite baseball team? Does he have a girlfriend? Like asking all these goofy questions because ultimately, I guess that's all that this movie wants to really be about. Like, what is Superman's weakness? Like, does he fight for America? Like, is he international? Is he global? Is like really all of that is to really help us figure out how far that this movie is just gonna like. That's the real trailer of it all. That's what should really be on the trailer is just like, yeah, this movie is just all about. Just ultimately having Superman getting to be familiar with everybody. And then eventually the ones that come after that are gonna have to be much more action packed and otherwise uh tie into Superman's past or otherwise just kind of be like, oh, okay, well here's the next step of villainy that's going to happen within either Lex Luthor or so and so other people. But, anyways, let's go out of our way to go into spoilers about this movie. Ultimately, there's just a lot to just kind of rush through. But there's some things that I think will be more important than other things. So, we ultimately have a tour, of course, as per usual. Let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again to spoil this movie. So recently, of course, we have in the beginning of this movie, we ultimately have a tour. Krypton is ultimately to be showcased, and we have it to where General Zod and his goons and his goonies, his other acolyte characters. We ultimately have Ursa and I believe the big oaf. I don't know his name. Oh, Non. Um, ultimately being on trial trial by Jor-El, and ultimately they ultimately deem that everybody's like, hey, he's guilty, throw him in jail, throw him in the Phantom Zone, bro. And so ultimately we have it to where Jor-El is the last person to say guilty or not guilty, and ultimately the plea has to be all everyone has to uh, say yay or nay or not, and we ultimately have it to where Zod is ultimately telling Jor-El, it's like, well, hey, you can be the last one of our fate. You can be the one to decide our fate. Ultimately, like, I will let you be my second Jor-El. And Jor-El is just walking off like, dude, I ain't got time to be your second. Like, nah, like, I know that our planet is going to die, and, like, I'm gonna peace out. Like, I'm deucing. I gotta go and save my planet from being destroyed. But the only thing is, Jor-El is mentioning, hey, my planet is being destroyed. What are you guys gonna do? And basically they're just like, well, we don't really believe you. Like, we don't really think that our planet is going to be destroyed. So do whatever you're going to do. And ultimately, we're just thinking that you're also going to be like committing insurrection, or you're going to try to you're going to try to tell us to evacuate this planet that is perfectly fine. And Jor-El's like, well, I'm going to leave then, and I'm just going to take my kid and my wife. Well, it seems that ultimately Jor-El cannot take his kid and wife. He can only take his wife and shoot him out into the world, Kal-El, to ultimately go all up and down Earth. Ultimately, it must have taken Kal-El several years to make it to Earth. So when Kal-El makes it on down to Earth, we have it where ultimately Kal-El is greeted by two farm hands. Um, we ultimately have the Kents. So ultimately, we have it to where it seems that they end up, of course, as per usual, for every single time you'd have a Superman story. The comet or the ship lands onto Earth, as well as in Smallville. There's several other meteors, but I guess in this variation, there's just the one ship that lands. And so ultimately, we have it where the Kents go and get Clark, and I guess ultimately in this story they ultimately mentioned that Clark is ultimately adopted to them because it's from some cousin of some family somewhere. Or ultimately that family died, so they just adopted him. That's their story that they're going to say to ultimately have just gotten Kent, or gotten Clark, I mean. So we ultimately have it to where we have that Martha is ultimately mentioning that's like, well, hey, like we have we'll just have him as our son, and ultimately Clark's father is mentioning, well, like we don't even know like if he has a family, like it maybe he has a family somewhere, but ultimately Martha's like, no, let's have him as a son. So because ultimately they have it to where ultimately Ken's father, who, God, I want to try to ultimately he's Pal Kent or Pa Kent in this movie. But ultimately I know that he's like Jonathan Kent in like Smallville. So we ultimately have let's just say Jonathan Kent ultimately under his car, and we have it to where Clark is picking up the car and ultimately telling us, wow, this kid's really strong. And so pushing on to where Clark is much older and he is ultimately on a football field and he's kind of like the nerd of everybody. He's kind of like the kid that actually isn't on the football team, but is ultimately just kind of cleaning up after all the football players, just kind of cleaning up all the equipment, to where eventually all of the football players end up uh, wrecking all the equipment, because ultimately Clark is going to want to try to go out with one of these girls, but it seems that all the other football players had wrecked all of the equipment, to where ultimately Clark has to spend numerous hours trying to clean up all the stuff that ultimately the football players had wrecked. I think in this movie we ultimately have Lana in this movie. I could be wrong, Lana Lang, um, which ultimately in the Smallville show there's a much more prominent role of that consistently. Um, but yeah, we have. I think in several of the movies we have it to where eventually like Lana is a prominent character in the Superman films that kind of like you probably forget about it a lot, but ultimately it's there. So we eventually Clark, after everyone leaves, kind of quickly put all the equipment together, and then we ultimately see that Clark is running as fast as he humanly can, right next to a train, which I think is the most amazing visual to like be seen in a movie, no matter how old this movie is. We seemingly have a young Lois Lane that is ultimately peeking out of a train, just going like, "Oh my God! Look at the guy! Look at him run! Look at him run! Like quickly and fastly, which makes no sense against this train locomotive." And ultimately, you have Lois's mother's like, "Nah, whatever, slap!" like, shut up, kid. You don't know what you're saying. I think you're losing your mind. We're gonna get you checked out. No, that's horrible. But ultimately, it's a joke. So we ultimately have it to where Clark is running, and ultimately he is to meet up with uh, all these guys in this car to ultimately showcase, like, oh, hey, well, I guess I made it in perfect timing, huh? And so we eventually have it to where eventually Clark is to make it home, and he is talking to his father, and like Clark is just kind of just annoyed that he's getting bested by all these guys, because he's like, dude, like, if they were to give me the football, I could score a touchdown every time. Like, it's kind of funny to see the visual where ultimately like Clark is kicking the football and it's just going like on forever. Kind of like when eventually we have Clark who like takes a baseball and a bat, and Clark throws the baseball up and hits it with a bat, and the baseball goes on forever. Like I just think that that's kind of an interesting visual, and I think the other one of the other Superman movies. So we have it to where ultimately Jonathan is ultimately talking to Clark, and ultimately like Jonathan is like, well, yeah, like I always believed that you were here for more um, than what you were like meant for, but it's like if anything we can't quite figure out what that is yet. And like eventually we also have we have Jor-El that also is telling via Kal-El's travels like all the stuff that he needs to hear as well, that basically they kind of mimic and repeat in the Man of Steel movie, where it's like where it's ultimately just talking about how time travel is forbidden, and ultimately mentioning it's like uh, that you will be stronger than all of them, and but ultimately at some point uh, like belief in these people and and ultimately like help them as they stumble and fall, because ultimately they will try to uh, run alongside you and blah 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 and all that jazz. So we have in here that we have eventually Jonathan, as Clark is walking off, eventually have a heart attack and die, which ultimately leads to, of course, Jonathan's funeral, and we have it to where Clark and Martha are there, and ultimately, Clark is ultimately mentioning it's like, with all the powers that I have, I couldn't save him, which I ultimately think is used in pretty much every single superhero movie when eventually they lose somebody, especially when they have their superpowers. Um, because that's always the same thing that you always go into is like, yeah, with all the abilities that I have, I couldn't save you. With all the with everything that I could have been able to do, I couldn't save this one person, which ultimately is their loved one. um, but the interesting thing is I kind of like how this kind of goes into like towards the tail end of this movie, because it very much reminds me of a of an episode in Smallville, and we'll get to that. Because ultimately, I think Smallville a lot of times tends to echo this show or echoes this movie, and tries to like do it justice or tries to just remember it and kind of reflect on it. But anyways, so we have it to where ultimately Superman is to eventually not be quite a thing yet. We ultimately have it to where Clark is ultimately, after some time now, having to tell Martha that it's like, I think it's time for me to leave. Like ultimately, I know a neighbor that is ultimately going to try and take care of this farm and stuff like that, but ultimately, I need to leave now. Like I need to leave from Metropolis. I think I need to do something now, and so ultimately we have it to where Clark leaves to go to Metropolis to ultimately become the Superman. Ultimately, we have it to where Clark eventually goes into becoming a news reporter, because like it's kind of funny how like in old fashioned times like anybody could just like go into a job and just like, sure man, yeah, just go ahead and be a news reporter, where like nowadays it takes like a arm and a leg to be able to get any kind of job, and heaven forbid you like everything will like work out really really well. um, but it seems like Perry White ultimately hiring Clark because ultimately he's the fastest typist he's ever seen. uh, we have to where eventually Clark is to ultimately get this job, and ultimately tell Clark tells Perry it's like, well, hey, can you send half of my check to this address? And ultimately we have Lois is ultimately just mentioning it's like, well, do you have a like a sick old gray haired mother that ultimately you're trying to take care of at home? And Clark goes, well, she's silver haired. And Lois is just like, oh, like, oh crap. Like, and ultimately she's like, well, is there anybody else like you at home? And he's like, no, like, because he's from a small town and called Smallville. So ultimately, we have to where eventually we have it to where Clark is, or wait, we skipped over a big thing. So Clark goes to leave to travel north before he goes and becomes a news reporter. We have him go to north where he travels and studies for years to be ultimately Superman. To ultimately kind of uh, get all the knowledge of his forefathers and stuff like that, to the point where all he needs to do is just come on in and go to uh, the Antarctica and just be able to come up with the Fortress of Solitude. Just put a little crystal in there and just get all the information that he needs. So we ultimately have it to where seemingly Clark becomes Superman after getting all this knowledge from Jor-El through a crystal of sorts, because he's dead, sadly. But it'll always be there, him and his mother and whatever, because crystals. So we have it to where ultimately Clark goes and becomes a journalist, and ultimately it seems that Clark is ultimately becoming Superman and doing these small little odd jobs, or these small little odd crimes and stuff like that. Ultimately, just trying to help people here and there. At some point, he eventually jumps onto a side of a plane to ultimately help them land their plane. And ultimately, you just have the pilot that was ultimately just like, yeah, don't look outside of the wing. Just like keep on flying the plane, and we'll be fine. It's like so. We have it to where eventually there's a burglar that is trying to like suction cup up this building, and we have it to where Superman is like, "Hey, you having a problem with an elevator there, buddy?" Ultimately, we have Superman like grabbing this burglar and turning him into the authorities. I'm like, well, he didn't even actually do a crime yet, but he's gonna confess that he was going to do one. Okay. Anyways, we have it to where ultimately, uh, the real premiere thing that Superman actually does is we have it to where Lois is going into a helicopter, and the helicopter starts to malfunction and starts to fall. Well, we have it to where ultimately Superman grabs Lois and then ultimately grabs the helicopter and then gets the helicopter and Lois to safety. To ultimately, again, that's where we have Lois ultimately saying like, you've got me, who's got you? Huh? Who's got you? So I love how that line's delivered. It's great. So we ultimately have it to where immediately Lois is just enamored with Superman, and so we have it to where it seems that every newspaper everywhere has covered Superman, but it seems like the Daily Planet or the Daily Bugle, good God, uh, Bugle Planet, good God, because ultimately Spider Man uh, and so on sword, Daily Bugle, I think. Good God, is Planet or Bugle? I think it's Daily. Yeah, it has to be Daily Planet. I think the Daily Bugle is Spider Man. Good God. So the Daily Planet, let's just say, because ultimately globe on top of building ultimately reminds me that planet. So Daily Planet, we have to ultimately the Daily Planet is to ultimately have Perry White be all crazy and like, I want to find out who this Superman is. And ultimately we have it to where when Superman ultimately saves Lois, he ultimately calls her, or he ultimately says that he's a friend. Lois is like, "What should I call you?" And he's like, "A friend." And then he leaves. He's like, "Yeah, mother." Like I'm big pimpin'. What should I call you? A friend. And then he leaves. He flies away. And so ultimately we have it to where like Perry White is like, I need to know like what's his favorite baseball team? Like, does he have a girlfriend? Where is he from? Does like is he American? And so on and so forth. And we ultimately have it to where like Clark sneaks in a little letter to Lois to ultimately like meet me at 8 o'clock, a friend. And she's ultimately like, a friend? And so recently we have it to where everybody needs the big old scoop on Superman, and ultimately Terry White is ultimately like, yeah, I want this to be front page. I want to know who this guy is, and ultimately instead of Clark getting his own scoop, which he should have done because that would have made him a bajillionaire. No, he just hands it off to Lois. And ultimately, what were to happen if Clark and Lois would have never been a thing? What if Lois would have just been like, you know what? I'm gonna fall in love with this Superman guy. I don't give a about Clark. Like, I'm never gonna fall in love with Clark. Like, f that guy. I hate him. Like, I hate that stupid guy. So I'm never gonna love him. And like, what would have happened if Lois would end up with like Jimmy or someone else? Like, it could have been any number of people that Lois could have ended up with. Lois could have ended up with Lex Luthor. Who knows? It could have happened. So, so going into this story, we have it to where Superman, like a pimp, ultimately goes and Lois is ultimately going to seemingly want to date Superman. She could have blown him off. She could have blew him off. She could have just said like, you know what? I don't like guys in tights, so you like, see you later. I don't really need this story all that bad. How about I just call Clark and you guys can do this story? Like I'll sit here while you two interview while Clark interviews you, and we'll see how that goes. Why didn't that ever come up? Why didn't that ever come up in this movie? That Lois would have wanted Clark there to ultimately just kind of be a co-person to this story, but that never happens. So that would be the one like brain thinking thing of like, well, I guess Clark would have had to have uh like spilt all over himself, and I'm like, oh well, I guess I need to go home to ultimately get a new shirt, and ultimately Lois would have been like, no, like stay here, I'll give you a new shirt, and he's like, no, I think I need to go to the shopping mall downtown to get a shirt, and I'll be right back. And then Clark would have never came back, and then Superman would have came in, and then Superman would have done like the interview, and ultimately it would have been the thing where ultimately Lois would be like, well, I'm waiting for my other guy, and then Superman would have ran off, and then ultimately Clark would have showed up, like, well, hey, like what happened? It would have been silly like that, but I think that would have been fun. But going on into here, we ultimately have it to where Clark is supposed to be a klutz in Lois's eyes, because ultimately uh, we have it to where Lois and Clark are going walking down a dark alley to eventually have it to where they end up getting mugged. We have it to where Clark is just like, just hand him the purse, Lois. And so ultimately, Lois is going to seem like she's going to hand him the purse, but ultimately she like tosses him the purse. To ultimately the mugger ultimately just fires upon them, and Clark ends up catching the bullet and then pretending that he faints. And we ultimately have it to where the mugger runs off, and Lois thinks that Clark was shot, and she's ultimately like, Clark, like, are you okay? And he's like, oh, I'm sorry, Lois, I must have just fainted. And Lois is like, come on, Clark. And ultimately you have it to where like Clark is like showing the bullet, and he's like, ha ha ha, ha, like like I saved her. So like I thought that moment was like really hilarious. So like a lot about this movie is just kind of like tongue in cheek, and it's kind of hilarious things going on at some points. So you ultimately have it to where like Clark is to consistently be like shown as a weakling, to where ultimately Perry is ultimately wanting Clark to ultimately open a jar for him, and of course he can't. He's like, and then ultimately like Lois is just kind of like banging uh the jar on there, and then she opens it and it's like, oh, I guess I loosened it for you, Lois. So we push on. So reasonably well, Clark is saving everybody and ultimately getting Lois's interview, to where ultimately uh, Lois has to ask like Clark, like, can you see what panties I'm wearing? Or ultimately Clark's like, oh, it's pink. And she's like, well, do you like pink? Ultimately, just like, a little tongue in cheek action there. To ultimately have it to where Lois is ultimately just kind of doing these questions and ultimately asking if he has a girlfriend and ultimately asking all these like how tall are you or how big are you, how old are you, or ultimately he has to kind of give a generic age because ultimately she's like, oh, you don't want people to figure out who how old you are and how blah 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 you are. And he's like, oh yeah, kinda. So we have it ultimately where they decide to fly because Lois is just kind of interested in how fast he can fly or um, how long it takes him to get to point A to point B and so on and so forth. So eventually, Clark ends up having Lois on a little test ride of flying, where ultimately I think at some point he ends up dropping her, but then recatches her at some point. But we ultimately have it to where like Lois gets on to the journey of being terrified of flying with Clark to ultimately or like her eyes are just like "Ah!" But then eventually she gets used to it. To ultimately we have Clark who is kind of just holding her hand and they're flying together, which kind of doesn't really actually make much of any sense. But I guess Lois has like the clothes that she's wearing are kind of like a like I guess would kind of be the equivalent of like a glider, a person that's kind of like gliding in the air of sorts, especially I guess with Superman. But again, like I would just kind of be like, okay, how is it that they're perfectly like flying in like a sequence like that? Because you would think that eventually like it wouldn't work out that way perfectly. But anyways, we have it to where they fly out and then they go back to ultimately Lois Lane is just kind of godsmacked by being with Superman, and so eventually, like we have it to where Superman ultimately tells Lois at some point as well that he can't see through lead because ultimately she's asking what panties she has on, and ultimately it's between uh, this lead thing that ultimately Superman can't see through. And then ultimately, when he does, ultimately Lois is just like, "Yeah, like that's gross that you can see through." And it's like, "Well, dude, you asked, you freaking asked." Like it's hilarious how all of a sudden like she becomes modest when Lois could actually see that Clark could see. It's like, oh well, I'm gonna be very modest now. It's like dude, he could see everything. He could see it all. Like it's okay. Ultimately eventually tells her that he's from Krypton, and ultimately you have to spell that out to her because it's Krypton with a K. So, anyways, pushing on. So we eventually have it to where Gene Hackman, ultimately Lex Luthor, is just kind of bitter about there being a guy in town who's saving everybody because ultimately if anybody was going to pull off that kind of feat it would have been him. And so ultimately the joke is that ultimately this guy must be out of this world because there's no way that anyone would be performing that kind of feat with the exclusion of Lex Luthor. So we ultimately get it to where this news article gets out about Superman and Lex Luthor is reading about it and ultimately to the point of him ultimately mentioning a ton of kernel of knowledge that it seems like they can accumulate from Superman from this article. So we ultimately find out that that Lex Luthor's character is mentioning about how uh, you can read this very extensive book and get like a huge kernel of knowledge out of it, or you can read a the back of a you can read a stick of chewing gum and be able to unlock the secrets of the world. And so we ultimately have it to where Lex Luthor is wanting to like decipher Superman to ultimately figure out his weaknesses, and ultimately they have figured out that kryptonite that ultimately had been that had gotten to Earth could quite possibly be Superman's weakness. And so reasonably we have it to where they have to go to a jeweler and get a kryptonite necklace that ultimately Superman has to wield at some point in this movie. But we'll get to that. So you ultimately have it to where seemingly Lex Luthor is going to get a uh, get a plan together to ultimately have these rockets shoot out to these two locations, because ultimately we want to have it to where Lex is going to own California at some point, and so we have it to where Lex is ultimately going and buying up just a ton of land to where ultimately he's buying it up for like seemingly ungodly amount, because ultimately he's going to destroy where that land is to ultimately have it be California is his own treasure trove of like California is going to be separated with the whole United States. So that's evidently the master plan, is to get one rocket that ultimately separates California with everywhere else. And then the other rocket is just going to go to some other place in New Jersey. So we have it to where they have that master plan concoct. We ultimately have it to where Otis is to ultimately give the coordinates into these rockets, uh, while Lex is ultimately portraying as this paramedic to revive revive Eve, Miss Tessmacher, Miss Tessmacher. So we have to where in this movie that we have this plan concocted, and now we eventually have it to where Clark is talking to Perry, and basically, like, Perry is telling Clark that he doesn't have any real, like, he's not a real go-getter, really. He's not, like, he doesn't have a real spine, and that ultimately he needs to really improve his job. And so we have to where Clark is hearing all this stuff, and also it seems that, like, Perry is also, like, talking about the same stuff that he did before, ultimately talking about, like, yeah, Clark, I think you need to, like, interview Superman. It's like tell me what his favorite cereal is. Like, where does he live? What does he do? Like, and so on and so forth. And while that is going on, we have ultimately this like really loud, freaking annoying sound that ultimately is to only be heard by seemingly dogs and cats and the Man of Super. And ultimately, we have it to where Lex Luthor is going through some emergency frequency that ultimately Superman could hear to tell him, hey, I'm going to shoot out some rockets, just so you know, just so you're aware. Like, hopefully you'll be able to stop them. And but ultimately, if you also want to go down underneath this ground level place to ultimately uh, try and defeat me, that would be great too. Because ultimately, we have it to where Lex is concocting some plan that ultimately becomes a fabrication until he comes up with a real plan later. The real plan was just to get Superman to ultimately come down to this underground layer that Lex had. So we ultimately have it to where Superman changes into his suit and ultimately goes into the underground, where ultimately we are seeing Superman just kind of bust through this door and make it to Lex. To ultimately, Lex is telling that, oh yeah, that plan was all really fabricated, but hey, I do have uh, this lead uh, treasure chest of sorts that ultimately might have something for you. And to where ultimately Superman's like, oh hey, like I bet you had this lead thing here, so I wouldn't be able to see what it is. And to where ultimately we have it uh, to where Superman opens it and it's the kryptonite. Where ultimately Lex Luthor throws the necklace of kryptonite on Superman and throws him into a pool where ultimately Superman is seemingly going to drown consistently, where he's just like bobbing his head up and down into the waters. And we ultimately have it to where Lex is ultimately just like, "Meh, I guess you're dead. I killed you." So he just goes off and just kind of fluffs off and doesn't actually see Superman die, which is the stupidest move I've ever seen in my life. And ultimately, he goes to shoot off these rockets. So he ultimately have it to where Miss Tessmacher ultimately realizes that one of the rockets is going to hit a place of some family member that she has that lives in New Jersey. So ultimately, she has to go and save the Super of Man. But before she ends up taking his necklace off, she makes out with him because she ultimately thought that she wouldn't be able to make out with him after he took the necklace off because he was going to shoot off and just try to save people, which ultimately he takes his sweet patootie doing after the necklace comes off because reasonably, like, he needed some time to just hold the head of Eve and just go, yeah, we have some good times together. And then he shoots off to ultimately go and take down one of the rockets. But then ultimately, the other rocket ends up going um, and uh, like separating this whole part of land, and ultimately we have Superman who is like re-putting the land back together piece by piece, and then ultimately he's like he's having it to where he's putting his body to where this train can go and move and stuff like that. And we have it to where ultimately like Clark is just scrambling because ultimately the Hoover Dam ultimately just is destroyed, and so ultimately all this water is coming down this place, and we ultimately have Superman who's tossing this big huge rock to ultimately have all this big huge rock just kind of crush all together and to block all of this water coming to this town, which ultimately looks like a Rector set of like a model of a town of sorts. And we ultimately have Superman just going, "Yeah, this is great. Like I think I've saved everybody, even to the point of having to save Jimmy. That ultimately he was on the Hoover Dam while this thing was all going on, and so we have to where Jimmy uh, is to like is to be taken by Superman and saved." And we have to where Lois is just driving off to where we find out that her car is dead. And ultimately, eventually, while this whole thing is going on and this whole earthquake and whatever thing is going on, we ultimately have it to where Lois is eventually getting buried within her car to ultimately be dead. To be dead! How could this have happened in this movie? Who knows? But ultimately, we have it to where Superman is ultimately eventually finding out that ultimately Lois is like losing air and losing breath and losing life. And so ultimately, we have it to where eventually uh, Superman ends up flying in and finding out where Lois is, but it's just too late. She's dead. And so ultimately, he takes her out of her car and ultimately kisses her, and then ultimately like puts her down, and he's like, yeah, and he flies off like, yeah, as you can have everyone in Earth hear Superman just go, yeah, as he flies off. And so like we have it to where in the clouds that Jor-El and all the people that Clark knows in the clouds ultimately telling him, it's like, yeah, you have it to where Jor-El's like, yeah, you shouldn't go back in time. You shouldn't do this. It's forbidden. And we have it to where everybody else is just like, yeah, like just do whatever you want, Superman. It's all good. Thumbs up. We have it to where Val Kilmer is flying in with the Batwing, ultimately going, is also going like thumbs up, and ultimately that's what Superman just like. Batman doesn't come into this movie. It's a joke. So, and ultimately I didn't do the joke right. It didn't land the way I wanted it to because ultimately the finger didn't land where I wanted it to. Where ultimately Superman comes in is like, it's like anyways, we have it where Superman just goes off and he flies. He's like, no! And so he flies off in his anger, in his rage, like Anakin did. And ultimately, we have it to where Superman just starts changing the Earth axis to where the Earth just spins around in opposite way, to where you can just see Superman just like all the way through the Earth. To where ultimately it's just like he changed its rotation, and to where the Earth went back in time bizarrely in that route, which makes no sense. But it is what it is. It's freaking Superman. That's his time. That's his time travel, baby. So when looking at it, I'm like, wait a minute. So you would have thought that every single time that like if Superman were to ever make a mistake, he'd just like, yeah, and he'd fly off, and everything would be solved. Like, dude, I travel back in time. I can do that all the time. Like every time that I'm angry enough, like I'm just gonna travel back in time and then solve everything. Like, oh, like someone ate the last donut. Yeah. I'm sorry, Perry, but I need the last donut. Yeah, sucks to be you. I don't have any toilet paper. No! Now I have plenty of toilet paper. Because I went back in time several years before, and we had toilet paper, so now I'm going to take a dump. I'm overusing the yeah in Earth removing, but Superman could go back through time. Why hadn't he used that way more often than just in this film? You would think that he would have been using that like all kinds of times. Like especially in Superman 4, The Quest for Peace, you would have thought that Superman would have just like went back in time before Lex Luthor uh, cloned Clark, and like you would have thought that Superman would have taken that thing of hair to where Lex couldn't have cloned Superman. You would have thought that would have been a thing, but no, he doesn't. You would have thought that ultimately, like, Superman would have been like, yeah, and flew back in time again numerous times, just be able to just, like, sleep with Lois repetitiously. Like, every single time that Lois is just like, you know what, not today, Clark, he would have just been like, no, and just flow back to that one point in Superman 2 where he could have slept with Lois again and just had that time where ultimately he could just been in love with Lois. But I guess that just can't happen. I don't know. It should. Not today, Clark. I have had a yeah. I'm doing jokes. It's hilarious, I think. So moving on. So we ultimately have now in Earth moving in counter backwards to where ultimately we have it to where Lois is ultimately trying to do a dead car And ultimately, you have it to where Superman is there to tell Lois that her car is dead, and to be able to get her away from all of this, to where ultimately Jimmy arrives and is ultimately mentioning, like, well, hey, Superman, thanks for the help that ultimately you left me in the middle of nowhere, hungry, thirsty, without toilet paper, and and this and that, to where Superman was like, yeah, and he flew out and he went back. So that way, ultimately, Jimmy was left in a better environment. So that way he wouldn't be coming and moaning and groaning to Superman where he left him off at. Dude, he saved your freaking life, and instead you're gonna just like moan and groan about where he left you at? God, what a piece of garbage that Jimmy is. So we ultimately have it to where uh, we have Lois being saved by Superman, and eventually he has to fly off to go and uh, Lex and Oten to be just kind of just tossed into some prison somewhere. But before that, we have it to where ultimately Lex had to yell, "Miss Tessmacher!" Because ultimately, when Superman is going and getting all these rockets and taking them down, uh, we hear the thoughts that ultimately the rockets had taken an odd trajectory to ultimately then uh, Lex is just to assume that Mrs. Smucker did something. So we have to ultimately we have to where ultimately Lex and Otis, Lex and Otis are ultimately to be put into this jail, and you ultimately have it to where uh, like the warden is ultimately thanking Superman for doing all this hard work, and ultimately Superman is like, well, I can't take all the credit. It's like, if anything, if we're working together, and then ultimately we have it to where he flies off, and you have it to where the warden's like, bye bye, Superman, and he just kind of like walks off. Uh, but anyways, like, and that's where eventually this movie just ends. Was just having Lex Luthor eventually like take off his wig like I do all the time, and ultimately tell him, "Yeah, I'm Lex Luthor," and to ultimately he's shouting all this nonsense, and Odin, Otis is repeating all the nonsense that Lex is saying. To ultimately he's like, "Shut up, you dumb schlub!" Like, I think the funniest part um is where Lex is going and getting some book, and you have it to where ultimately Otis is taking the ladder from under Lex, and to where ultimately Lex is just hanging on to some like bookshelf, and he's like, Otis, and so we have it to where Otis gets the ladder back to Lex, and you have it to where Lex is just stepping on the feet of Otis as Otis is getting to where Lex needs to be to grab some book. Funniest moments in these book in this movie is just kind of like is kind of shaming Otis and just kind of making him like dude, like, this guy is stupid. But that's the whole thing. You always have to have like a stupid sidekick that, like, I think it's a little much that they kind of like I think the funniest thing is when ultimately Otis is to have cops chase after him in the very beginning of this, and we have it to where these cops are otherwise eventually killed by this subway train, and we ultimately have Otis who is ultimately just walking, making his way to Lex Luthor, and you ultimately have it to where like it's where Lex is mentioning like, man, it's amazing how much blood has to be pumped into that into that man to have his brain work to ultimately just be able to walk. Like the simplest things of just like trying to ridicule this person for just being like the dumbest guy that ultimately like can't even probably figure out how to walk, much less do anything else. But it seems that Lex needs Otis to be able to survive at some point. But anyways, I think that's all I wanted to say about this movie. It's very interesting. I enjoy it. There's little like hints of a better movie on the way, with having the interesting moments of us getting to where ultimately the Phantom Zone glass thing, which ultimately is like, hey, help me, I want to get out of here. Ultimately cracks, to ultimately that leads to Zod and Non and and everybody just out of the Phantom Zone. To me, you would have thought that the sequels would have just kept been talking about the Phantom Zone, but I guess only there's only three members in the Phantom Zone. But anyways, so yeah, I thought that this movie was just fun. Again, it's just like it's fun nostalgia to ultimately just kind of watch this movie. I like the original Superman movies, even though realistically how slow they are. I also like the Supergirl movie. I thought that that was kind of like I really enjoyed that one. I think there was like it there. There's stuff in it that I think is kind of goofy, but when looking at it, I just enjoy that one as well. But yeah, so but looking at it, yeah, I just enjoy these old fashioned films, or old fashioned. I don't want to say old fashioned because when looking at it, like a a much earlier approach to films, I guess, because really like these ones kicked off eventually having there be more DC movies eventually. And I think really the early ones are probably the best, and then they just kind of eventually just realized, oh, we can just make money with these bad boys. So we don't have to have we don't have to have a good movie. It just has to be a movie that just has to exist. And then when watching it, it's like, yeah, what made this like? Why did you have to take so much time to do this movie? And we just keep getting those and getting those and getting those. And eventually we're going to be getting a Justice League Snyder cut, which ultimately I'm like, that's not going to make a better movie. That's just going to make a movie that already exists longer. And so like that's all we're going to get. Mostly scenes that we have probably already seen, and I'm just like looking at it, I'm like, okay, how is this going to be a different film? How is it going to be a better film? And because ultimately they're like basically going to the drawing board again and going to have to redo an entire film basically is what they're going to do with this movie. And so hopefully they take that and make a better film out of it. I didn't quite understand what the heck was even going on with any of that Flash part. I'm like, what is that? Like, that made no sense of what was going on with Flash. But eventually they're going to do a Flashpoint. So I would assume that ultimately we're probably going to have any number of things that ultimately will remind us uh, of any of these movies. But sadly enough, like we won't be able to have like Superman from the original film come in here, but we'll ultimately have Batman, of course. So, because ultimately I'm hoping that they don't like CG like Christopher Reeves in. I don't like that. I'm like, no, like no, don't do that. Like that'll be weird. That'll be weird. But anyways, speaking of weird, I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.